Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th, then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th, and finally the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time. I offered to meet with him as soon as possible.
That was Al Gore conceding the 2000 election to George Bush. It was the election that divided the country, when the voting in Florida was so confused it did not yield a clear winner on the night. Eventually, it was the Supreme Court that stopped the counting and declared Bush the winner. What would have happened if Al Gore had claimed the presidency? That's the first in our special US version of What Ifs. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the 2000 election really was a nail-biter. It was all down to Florida, and the English language suddenly had to grapple with something called a hanging chad. And essentially, there was a dispute over votes cast. Imagine a punch hole that you've got file paper and you want to punch it so it can fit into your file, the ring folder file. Well, when the holes weren't punched completely and there was a bit of paper still left, that became known as a hanging chad, and whether it should be admitted or not as a vote for one or other candidate. And the free world, the most powerful person on the planet, was going to be decided on a basis of whether the punch hole had gone through properly on the ballot paper.
God, just hearing you explain it.
In a few hundred
incredible
votes in Florida.
Yeah.
So to remind people about this election, particularly younger listeners won't necessarily be familiar with this, is the 2000 presidential election. Bill Clinton has been in office for 2 terms as Democratic president. He's obviously in the second term been mired in scandal with the Lewinsky scandal and so on. His vice president, Al Gore, is running for the presidency itself. Bill Clinton himself is somewhat sort of kept at arm's length during that campaign, partly because of those scandals. And we have this very unusual situation where George W. Bush, the son of the last president but one, George H.W. Bush, the governor of Texas, is running in his own right. And it's a really, really tight election. And as election night goes on, we can see how tight that it is. And you end up in a situation where Al Gore has 266 electoral votes, so he's 4 away from 270, and George W. Bush has 246. And it all comes down to Florida, which we now think of as like the home of MAGAism and Trumpism, but at that time was the swingiest of swing states. It had 25 electoral votes, and something really weird happens. On the night, it is called for Bush by the networks. And then Gore concedes the election to Bush. But then as the votes keep coming in, and you can see the margin is getting tighter and tighter and tighter, Gore actually retracts that concession, and so do the network. So you have this weird thing where they're saying, and you can watch it on YouTube, you can see we had called Florida for George W. Bush, he's won the election. The networks say, actually, we're taking Florida away from George W. Bush. This election is too close to call. We don't know who's won.
Until the recount is concluded and the results in Florida become official, our campaign continues.
Yeah, and it went right through the courts, and it ended up with a margin of 537 votes. That's 0.009%. And I think what is important to note is that it was ended by lawyers in the end, because if it had been recounted on a county basis, they think Bush would have won. If it had been recounted on a state basis, they think Gore would have won. So everything that has happened since 2000 in those 2 Bush terms could have been completely different. Al Gore, the man who most famously perhaps went on to talk about climate change more forcibly than any other politician since.
If you look at the 10 hottest years ever measured, they've all occurred in the last 14 years.
And the hottest of all was 2005. scientific consensus is that we are causing global warming.
I am Al Gore. I used to be the next president of the United States of America.
And this is why this election is so tantalising and interesting, right? Because it's basically where modern American politics kind of hones into view properly. The electoral map looks quite familiar. You go back to the previous election in '96. The Dems are winning. Places like Arkansas and Louisiana. It looks a completely different world. This looks really familiar with the Democrats sort of winning along the coast, and this all being decided in this case in Florida, but in some place in the Midwest as well. And this all ends up, again, in a glimmer of our own politics. It ends up being decided by a highly partisan Supreme Court judgment, which basically decides that the recounting, which had been going on for the past couple of weeks, this process takes 2 to 3 weeks, the recounting in Florida has to stop. And it's decided by a 5-4 judgment with guess what? The 5 judges who had been appointed by Republican presidents voting for Bush, and the 4 that had been appointed by Democrats voting for Gore. Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court decides, and they hand the election to George
So I was on air that day. We were at Sky News, and I think the other part of this story, which is really interesting to remember, is the reason that Gore conceded the first time was because of Fox News. Now, Fox and Sky were kind of partners at the time. They're both part of the Murdoch empire, and I think it's the first time that Fox News, and it was the Roger Ailes culture. Roger Ailes kind of came of age as part of the George Bush, the first sort of, advisory coterie. And he was the one, Fox News was the one that called it for Bush. Before the counting had been done, they went out and they made a call. Now, this is, as we know, how American elections work. There's nobody in a big hat declaring it. There's nobody on the stage. You don't have the candidates all there. You just have networks calling it. And it became a super powerful moment in the vision of Fox News.
And Roger Ailes, of course, we should go on to say, was the later disgraced head of Fox News, and the whole Me Too movement. Horrendous behaviour
that
came
into television from political advising. So obviously felt he owed something still to the Bush dynasty.
But this again brought us to something else that I just don't believe we would ever see in British politics, which was the courts, in essence, deciding who the ruler should be. Now, we know the Supreme Court in history of America plays a critical role in abortion law, in gun law, in any other kind of hot button issue that where there is a live rail that you touch it and you electrocute yourself. But on this one, deciding elections, that again took us into new territory where the Supreme Court got involved in something where you would have thought they'd have thought, why we don't want to pick who the next president is. But the ordering of the recount to stop was a political decision. And it's hard to see it in any other light other than that. And again, that was the start of another process, which is the erosion of trust in the Supreme Court as an institution, where justices are there for life. And again, there are murmurings again about whether there should be fixed terms for a Supreme Court justice now.
Okay, so let's talk about the politics of Bush versus Gore, because they were pretty different. They were pretty different political operators. And I guess what we don't know is whether a year later we would have seen Al-Qaeda and 9/11. But, we can only do one what if per episode. So let's imagine that 9/11 did happen. Would Gore have responded in the same way? It's
a really, really interesting question. And it's such a good what if because, with 530, forget the recount element of it. If just 538 people had decided to vote the other way, 537, 538, then Gore may well have become president. And it does feel a real pivotal turning point because let's assume, as you say, Emily, that 9/11 does happen. I think that, they are it's not just that the two people, Gore and Bush, are very different. The people around them are very, very different as well, right? So what you wouldn't have had with a Gore administration is the circle of neoconservatives, as they were called, hardline, hawkish figures on foreign policy, like Donald Rumsfeld, like Dick Cheney, all
who'd already been into Iraq once.
Exactly.
And failed to get Saddam Hussein the first time round.
Yeah, so you would have had you would have had the Democrats dictating the response to 9/11. I think you can see a timeline where President Gore would have invaded Afghanistan to get bin Laden. I think the dynamics there would have been very, very similar. I think Iraq, I think it is very hard to see how the Iraq War happens with a President Gore, because it is very clear, and we know this from the scholarly research since, and what many people, contemporary people said at the time, it is very clear that pretty much from 9/11 onwards, there are people in the Bush administration, including principally but not limited to Dick Cheney, who are gunning for using this as a pretense to invade Iraq and to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And we can get into the reasons as to why that was. But I find it difficult to imagine that a President Gore and a Democrat administration would have approached that question the entirely same way. And given that I think that...
Mind you, Blair did.
Yeah, but he was taking his lead from Bush.
Well, yes and no. So I think it's impossible to imagine that Osama bin Laden was somehow waiting on the outcome of the hanging charge of the Supreme Court case to decide whether he would launch 9/11. 9/11 was going to happen, and you had seen the problems with Al Qaeda preceding 9/11. Clinton went after, and the famous news conference that Blair gave with Clinton in 1998, and I was at that news conference in the White House. There were two stories. One was Monica Lewinsky, and the other was that it had just launched missile strikes against targets of Al Qaeda. So 9/11 would have happened. I am absolutely convinced that Afghanistan and the removal of the Taliban with US backing Northern Alliance forces would have gone on regardless. Blair was very keen on intervention and the argument for kind of liberal interventionism, the idea that gained a certain amount of currency at the time, and this preceded Iraq, was that you could have regime change and you could impose democracy. And there was an ideological underpinning to some of it. And the Blair gave this speech in Chicago. It was at the time of the 50th anniversary of NATO, when he had gone over to Washington. He flies up to Chicago, delivers this speech, which makes the case for it.
And so I say to you, never fall again for the doctrine of isolationism, because the world truly cannot afford it. Stay, please, a country outward-looking, with the vision and the imagination that is the very best of your nature. And realize too that in doing so, you will have in Britain a friend and an ally that will stand with you, work with you, fashion with you the design of a future built on peace and prosperity for all, which is the only dream that makes humanity worth preserving. Thank you.
And so it wasn't just the hawks and the neocons who were pushing the Iraq agenda.
Yeah, but come on. Blair might have wanted to invade Iraq, but he couldn't have done so without the... And we know that Gore... We got the control for this because Gore opposed the Iraq War in the run-up to the invasion. Unlike some Democrats, like Hilary Clinton, for example, or Joe Biden, Gore publicly in 2002 opposed the Iraq War and said that the Bush administration was using, explicitly say this, but basically suggested that this was being used as a pretense, 9/11 and so on, to invade Iraq. So I find it very hard to imagine a situation in which, and we know, I mean, you mentioned the Chicago speech, John, the Clinton administration was not always very happy with Blair and that particular type of doctrine. Clinton himself and the Democrats at that time, we think of them as a bit more of the war party now. They were more the anti-war party at that time. And Clinton himself was much more sceptical than Blair was about foreign intervention. And I'm not sure, I just do not see a world in which Gore wouldn't have continued with that. And I think if that's the case, I think the Iraq War, along with the 2008 financial crash, I think the Iraq War, two seminal events of the 21st century so far, and 9/11 as well.
But
I think that if you don't have Iraq, I think the whole recent American political history is very, very different.
One of the questions that this raises is whether we would have had a politician on the world stage who would have put climate change right at the heart. Like, did Gore fall back onto the question of climate change because he needed, to sort of find his niche after he wasn't president? Or would he have literally put it right at the right... I mean, would we be in a totally different world in terms of where we are with COP, where we are with climate emissions, where we are with carbon emissions, would we have absolutely revolutionised the world if Gore had been president?
Well, Bush, of course, one of the first things he did was withdraw from the Kyoto Protocols, which Clinton had signed up to. So it's certainly, I think Gore would definitely have put the issue more centrally than Bush did, for sure.
Just going back to the White House sometimes being irritated with Blair and the intervention, I flew with Blair on his plane from Washington up to Chicago when he did that speech, and did an interview with Blair on the plane. And it was, again, about the case for intervention, and this time in the Balkans. And apparently, and I've only read this in a book that was written by a Downing Street press officer, that Alistair Campbell went to the pilot and asked him to carry circling round O'Hare Airport for 15 minutes so that we could finish the interview before landing the plane, because Blair was determined to get this point across about the need for intervention from the US administration, as wanting to send a memo to kind of Bill Clinton, which was an extraordinary thing to do.
But I think, if you don't have Iraq, I mean, not only do lots of people live who would have died, British soldiers, American soldiers, Iraqis, among others, it was a geopolitical catastrophe for the United States. They spent enormous blood and treasure and national prestige. So the whole geopolitics of the region ends up different. But also, I think that in terms of, I don't think you get Donald Trump.
Yeah, would you have Trump?
I don't think you get Donald Trump without two things. I don't think you get him without the financial crisis, which basically delegitimized the sort of political system, and I don't think the financial system, and you don't get him without Iraq, which helped delegitimize the political system.
The erosion of trust.
There could have been another war.
They could have, of course, they could have done. But the sort of Iraq was a crucial stepping stone to the post-truth world that we now live in.
The most amazing thing is, though, that at the time, I mean, it always struck me that the argument linking what they had done to the Taliban, that somehow the Taliban were in Iraq, there was never any evidence provided for that. Yet in America, there was very, very little protest about the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
No,
it was kind of taken as this is the next step. It was only when it started to go to shit, and you realised the huge number of lives that were being lost trying to, keep these warring factions apart, that people began to question. At the time, there was strong support for it.
We'll be back. We have more what ifs, your what ifs.
So this next what if is about a different presidential election, and it's about probably, apart from 2000, the seminal one of the 21st century, which is the 2016 presidential election. But the what if doesn't relate to the presidential election as such, but it relates to one of the primaries. In this case, a Democratic primary. Obviously, this is the election where Donald Trump manages to completely unexpectedly to take the Republican nomination. But there is also, and this is forgotten a little bit more now, but there is also a big, big fight for the Democratic nomination of that year. And it is a fight that no one really saw coming.
Let's get going. Please join us in welcoming Secretary Hilary Clinton and Senator Bernie Sanders.
But she is then Secretary of State. Joe Biden decides not to run. Maybe we can talk about that. But she decides to run, and everyone assumes she's going to walk it. And in the end, she ends up in a really close fight, really nasty fight, with a guy who had not even really been a Democrat up to that point. And that was Bernie Sanders, senator from Vermont. And they end up having a really pitched battle, which runs along lines that have become very familiar to us now, which is basically you have a sort of establishment type candidate voice in Hilary Clinton running on electability, and Bernie Sanders running on an economically populist agenda, which in some ways mirrors some of the themes that Donald Trump runs on, not just for the primary, but also in the presidential election of that year.
Yeah, so I was sort of North America editor at this time, and you kind of think, well, it's going to be a shoo-in for Hillary. Mm-hmm. She's going to walk this. And Bernie Sanders, who describes himself as a democratic socialist, and no one in America who seriously wants office uses the S word to describe themselves, because that is,
freak.
I mean, you freak, you are radioactive. If I touch you, I am going to get the Ebola virus. But Bernie Sanders did. And suddenly there are young people energised in a way that I couldn't quite believe.
Feel the burn.
Feel the burn. And he was rampaging up and down the country. In a lot of ways, bloody awful orator. He couldn't speak. All he could do was shout in a very loud voice.
Brilliant.
Sound like Groucho Marx.
Okay, that's also my Groucho Marx impression.
Okay.
But it was...
He never became the...
No, he did
credit nominee either.
Yeah, But it was gaining ground, and it was kind of really alarming for Hilary Clinton, and because she could see a repeat of 2008 all over again.
And this does go back to the Iraq War, actually, because and I remember covering the Iowa caucus, and we went to people's houses and we listened to people actually having these arguments, and they called her a warmonger and they called her a hawk, and I had not understood the force of that distrust until I heard that. But I think things really evolved on the 22nd of July, which was the start of the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, when there was this WikiLeaks dump. Now, we've sort of moved away from, the days of the WikiLeaks stuff. But just to remind you, if you're coming to this for the first time, it was incredible the cache of emails and documents that was suddenly released onto the world, partly through Russian interference. And some emails came to light which did more than suggest, which showed that the operatives in the Democratic Party at the top had derided Bernie Sanders' campaign and had sought to suppress his vote, his position, and push Hillary Clinton's, which became a massive scandal at a time when people should have been talking about why is Russia interfering in the election. They were actually talking about the fact that Bernie seemed to be on the back foot, and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was the head of the DNC, resigned because she couldn't justify it. So it made for such a toxic atmosphere at the DNC that year because everyone was watching to see, would Bernie Sanders back Hillary? Would she say anything? Would she reach across the aisle? He did.
We need leadership which brings our people together and makes us stronger. By these measures, any objective observer will conclude that based on her ideas and her leadership, Hillary Clinton must become the next president of the United States.
And he asked his supporters to back her. Many did not want to.
Many did not. And as Lewis says, the message of economic populism was very similar to Trump's. That, he wanted to see tariffs. He wanted to see manufacturing brought back. And he was kind of coming at it from a very similar view. And so at that convention in Philadelphia, you had all sorts of delegations. I remember standing with the California delegation where they were saying there is no way I'm voting for Clinton in November. I am voting for Donald Trump. I am not voting for Hillary Clinton. I thought, this is unbelievable.
They said that they were voting for Trump.
There were people there who overtly said, and Trump was brilliant in the way that he said, it's so cruel the way they've treated Bernie. So unfair, etc., etc. And that resonated. And there were people who found themselves thinking, you know what, I've got more in common with Trump than because they hated Clinton and they hated the machine that went with Clinton. This kind of steamroller that was going to roll over them.
So this is why I think this is an intriguing what if, because, I think she ended up getting 55% of the primary delegates, he got 43%. So if there'd been a 10% flip the other way, to think if he had been the Democratic candidate in that year, might the result have been different? And I'm just going to I think you'll disagree, John. So I will put the case to why I think that why it could have been different. And I'd say this, or at the very least, how politics would have been very different. That election would have been very different anyway. Trump would have had to fight a very different election in 2016. He would have not been able to be the populist, or at least he would not have been able to have a monopoly on populism. What we now know about the politics of the United States and our own politics over the last 10 years is that the 2008 crash unleashed forces of anger, discontent with the system as it is, and that the Democrats under Obama were seen not to prosecute properly. I mean, they literally didn't prosecute anyone responsible for the financial crisis, for example, which created a toxin in politics. That energy was going somewhere. We now know it was going somewhere and that it would be a winning energy. And what the Democrats did by nominating Hillary, and then Harris as well, most latterly, is allow Trump to have a monopoly on that anger and that populism. And if Bernie had been in the race, he wouldn't have had a monopoly on it. And he would have had to, maybe Trump would have won anyway, but he would have had to fight a very different campaign than the one he fought against Hillary.
We cheated a bit. We put this question last week to James Carville,
who
was Clinton's strategist. Cheated. We asked him his thoughts on this, and he just said, do you know the one word he said? Immigration. Bernie Sanders was always an advocate of immigration. He believed in its power to change America, to help the American economy. And actually, if you think back, the message that never changed from Trump, right from day one, was stopping the Mexicans coming over the border. And he thinks that's where Bernie Sanders would have come a cropper. That, yeah, you
Possibly.
can fight as the populist, you can fight as the outsider, you can fight as the person who doesn't like big business. But his anti-big business message would have had to be louder than Trump's anti-immigration message. And that's where your clash comes.
This is where I disagree with you, Lewis, partly exactly the immigration question. I just think the centre of political gravity in the United States of America, historically and to this day, is further to the right than it is in the UK. And I think that Bernie Sanders represented socialism. Yeah. And I think he would have become an incredibly difficult... To a European, there was nothing that Bernie Sanders said that you thought was any way remarkable. I believe in socialised medicine. I believe in healthcare for all. Well, yeah, I mean, we take that for granted. In America, they do
Minimum
not.
Wage.
They see that as not just the slippery slope to communism, they see it as communism. And so I think that those sort of arguments from Bernie Sanders would have fired up a lot of young people who tend not to vote in the huge same numbers as older people do, but would have scared the bejesus out of older people who would have thought, you know what, this
would
is
he
mad.
have repelled more than he attracted? I mean, I just think
yes.
That, well, that's my judgment.
Know.
I think this is I think the intriguing question, because what we have got is we have got 3 elections in which Trump has been involved, and each time the Democrats have nominated someone from the establishment. The most economically populist of the 3 was Joe Biden, and Joe Biden wins. So it would have been truly fascinating to have that control of having a true economic populist, i.e. Sanders, go up against Trump. And Trump would have had to, and there is a really intriguing then second counterfactual, if Sanders wins. Because if Sanders wins, it's not the Republicans that end up kind of being taken over. It's the Democrats.
But
it's the Democrats that have to... And then you can imagine a world in which the Republicans basically become the establishment party and the Democrats are the populist one.
But the Democrats also won the election where they were out of power. They were fighting the incumbents, and
sure.
Sanders, would he have been seen as an outsider to Obama? I don't know.
Oh, he would. He'd just taken over the Democratic Party.
Having argued against Lewis, I'm going to come in with 2 points of what were in Sanders' favour. Guns. Yeah, guns. Number 1. He was a Second Amendment man.
Which Hillary ran against him on.
Hillary ran against him.
They have a lot of guns in Vermont.
A huge number of guns in Vermont, and he supported hunting and
an
all
old white man who probably would have...
And an old white man. No misogyny. There was no misogyny there, and there was no private use of an email server.
I was going to say he would have got the Great Lakes states, right? Maybe.
And there's no Comey. There's no Comey. If you believe that the Comey intervention in the dying days of the campaign, which Bill Clinton certainly does, he was repeating this the other day, cost Hillary the election, then there is no Comey because there is no email story about Bernie. There may have been
Mind you would have dug up some dirt on Bernie. Probably.
Like what? Like what? He's got...
Well, there's a sort of strange puritanism about Bernie, isn't there? I mean, he's kind of
he's got
real
that
old
Corbyn
school.
element of him.
There is a very strong Corbyn element to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, well, they were good friends.
Yeah, and I kind of think for similar reasons... unelectable.
But just imagine, if he hadn't got in, they would have said, a bit like Corbyn here, right, we're never trying the socialists again.
Totally.
Yeah. We've got to really swing to the right now.
I suppose the final thing, actually, I suppose, the big question is of course, in that year, had Biden won, whether he would have beat Trump. And that is had Biden
I think
run,
absolutely he would have
If Obama hadn't dissuaded him from running, would Biden have beaten Trump as he did in 20?
There's a whole episode there of the toxic bad blood between Obama and Biden over the advice that Obama gave Biden
but Biden
against
could
running.
not, first black president, could not have supported an elderly white man after him.
His VP.
Had to support the woman, I think. We'll be back. We're going to end with this question from Walker Green. What if Joe Biden had a nice little nap just before that debate against Donald Trump, which changed the whole campaign?
Maybe he did.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, I'd be happy to have a driving contest with him. I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6. And by the way, I told you before, I'm happy to play golf with you if you carry your own bag. We're in a situation where there are 40% fewer people coming across the border illegally. It's better than when he left office. And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
I'm going to say I don't think it would have made any difference whatsoever. I think that Biden was not in a great place. That I'm told that 2 days before the debate took place, White House staff had considered what would be the political cost of postponing because they were so concerned about Biden and the way that he didn't seem to be himself and a little out of sorts. And I just think, you know what?
Mike Murphy revealed this week, the Republican strategist, that he was pulled in by the Democrats and they said, what would you do with this? And he said, I'd switch him out.
Yeah, but it would have been, I mean, look, it was a catastrophe that it happened, and it would have been the firestorm that would have engulfed and the rumour mill that would have gone on if he hadn't done that.
But here's the what if. What if Joe Biden had not thrown down the gauntlet of that TV debate to Donald Trump?
No, I think in a way, it's one of those things which is like, you can argue it made very little difference to the outcome of the election, in the sense that it feels very likely with all of the metrics that there were, people think the country was on the wrong track, inflation that Biden would have lost in November. But what it definitely did mean is that he wasn't the nominee. You know, if that debate hadn't happened, it's very, very highly likely that Biden would have been the nominee and that Harris wouldn't have been, and that he would have led the Democrats into the election and probably lost it.
It's so funny because, Emily, you and I were together in Washington, I think it was in March, and the two things we were told, we went to this big dinner with all sorts of kind of luminaries from the Democratic Party. And the two things we were told would be absolutely certain was, one, there wouldn't be any TV debates, and two, Joe Biden would be the candidate. And there was a TV debate, and it cost Biden the candidacy.
They'll never have us back to dinner, will they?
Never again. Who would? We'll see you next time.
That's our last show of 2024.
Well,
see you in 2025, everybody.
Is that our last show? We should be making terrible predictions then, but we won't. We've got one more what if, which is for the new year, and that will be in your feeds shortly.
On the 2nd.
And we're back on the 6th. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.